Welcome everyone to today's CompetencyWorks and iNACOL webinar. I would like to introduce the co-founder of CompetencyWorks and principal at MetisNet, my friend and colleague, Chris Sturgis. Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Susan. Hi, everybody. Okay, so we are just delighted to have you here at the webinar on implementing competency education in K-12 systems. And it's based on a paper that CompetencyWorks just released earlier this month that hopefully you have read, but you can find it on our webpage. A few bits of housekeeping. This webinar will be archived, and you can also find this PowerPoint on the CompetencyWorks wiki, and you should be able to see that website link right now. Second, we really use our chat room extensively, as we believe is really important part of building our networks. So please take a moment, if you haven't, and introduce yourselves, where you're from, and your experience with competency education. We also use the chat room to ask questions. So Natalie Abel, who's part of our CompetencyWorks team, will be she's from iNACOL, will draw together the questions that you raise in the chat room, and we will pause periodically after each panelist to answer some of those questions. Also, if you're want to, try to answer those questions and share resources in the chat room. And third, we want to take this opportunity right now, before we go any farther, to thank our partners. CompetencyWorks is a project of the International Association for K-12 Online Learning. And as you know, the field of competency education is advancing so rapidly, and we just want to thank our partners who helped us launch CompetencyWorks: American Youth Policy Forum, the National Governors Association, Jobs for the Future, and our funders, Nellie Mae Education Foundation, who was our co-partner in launching, and Donald K. Foundation, Carnegie Corporation, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Now, we have some extraordinary presenters today. We have Dr. Robert Crumley, Bob Crumley, who's the superintendent of Chugach School District, Alaska, and hosted me for about 3 days, which was an incredible experience. Virgil Hammonds, who's the superintendent of RSU2 in Maine, and is soon to become the Chief Learning Officer at KnowledgeWorks. And Derek Hamilton is the Dean of Operations at Pittsfield School District in New Hampshire. So the way we're going to structure this conversation is that we're going to focus quickly on some key issues, and then I'm going to turn it over to our guest panelists, who are going to talk from their personal experiences. So we have 3 goals in mind for today. We want to make sure that folks understand competency education as a structure that enables greater personalization and flexibility to respond to students. The goal is to make sure that students are successful. We also want to make sure that you become familiar with the 4 stages of implementation and the district leadership issues that arise during the transition. But before we move there, let's just take a minute for folks who are new to competency education to review the working definition. Now, first of all, we use the language competency education. You'll hear competency-based education, proficiency-based learning, performance-based learning, and mastery-based learning. And I'm sure somebody will create some new language. But at this point, we believe that there's 5 common elements to the work. First, that students advance upon mastery, which means no more passing students on to the next grade level with a C or a D. Schools are taking responsibility for ensuring that students actually learn. Second, there's a commitment to transparency that empowers students and enables greater personalization, as we know exactly where students are in terms of building skills. That is, of course, communicated in grades, and that is one of the big changes, is shifting to scoring versus the traditional A through F grading. Third, the assessment is part of the learning cycle and provides meaningful feedback to students. This is a much stronger emphasis on formative assessment. And fourth, students receive timely support. This is a critical piece. Many competency-based schools fail to do this in their first year. We want to make sure that students every day have access to someone who can help them when they're struggling. And finally, competency education is ensuring that students can transfer and apply content and skills to new contexts. It also recognizes that the lifelong competencies and habits of learning are an essential ingredient to students having ownership over their education and developing the independent learning skills students need for college. Now, I'm sure if you have more questions about competency education, please ask in the chat room, or you can find a detailed definition at the wiki. The most important thing is to think of this as a systemic or structural change. There is a misconception that competency education is the same as self-paced or flexible pacing. It is not about the pacing alone. It is much more about flexibility in resources, time, and effort to make sure that students are successful. Okay, so I have to thank Bob Crumley, who really started to talk about 4 phases of implementation. As I looked across different districts, I made some slight changes, but this is what I saw as the 4 phases of implementation. 1 is ramping up for transformation. Now, Bob is going to kick us off on that section. And then designing the infrastructure for learning, Virgil Hammond from RSU2 in Maine will talk about his experience there. And then transitioning to the competency-based system, Derek Hamilton will talk to us about their experience in Pittsfield. We are not focusing on embracing continuous improvement and innovation at this point because so many districts at this point in time are focused much more on those first 3 levels. Now, the ramping up for transformation has 3 elements. It's about building the leadership style for districts that empower others, constructing a journey that leads to a strong culture of learning, and creating a shared vision that can guide the districts through the implementation process. I've actually come to firmly believe that if this part isn't done well, then the districts may have difficulty implementing with fidelity, as the culture of the traditional system remains intact. As a structural reform, we actually have to replace the values and assumptions of the traditional system with something else. And the ramping up process is in fact where we create what I call the spirit of competency education. And Bob will kick us off now to talk about his experience there. Bob, I am clicking off my talk button and then you get to click it on.
Okay, thank you so much, Chris, and I really appreciate you inviting me to participate. It's an honor to participate. I expect to learn as much as I share today, and I'll try to watch to see if anybody needs to interject, and I need to turn my talk button off as I'm going through this, and I'll also try to be as brief as possible so I don't hog the time from other participants. The first slide that I have here is one that I wanted to include because I just ran across it. It's research based on the, from what the Wallace Foundation supported. And it really includes a whole lot of information that we learned over the past 20 years. But it's based on research, and ours was based on a whole plethora of things, from just some common sense, from community, student, staff input, looking at research ourselves, staff experience. But it really shows how a system can be developed to meet student needs. So many systems are built to meet the adult needs, to track students, and we're very focused on building our system to meet student needs as they advance from early childhood through to graduation. And I won't read the slide to you. You can see all that information and look it up online. But I just wanted to make that resource available because it does capture so much important information that aligns with our philosophies. And I would go to the next slide. Do I do that, or do you do that, Chris? Oh, thank you.
I'll do it for you.
Thanks. That was a quick answer. This next slide, one of the fortunate experiences we had as a district in the middle of our reform process was to get involved with the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award. And we were kind of surprised in 2001 when we were the first education recipient of that. At the same year, there was a second one. I think it was Pearl River in New York, but the first 2 were in 2001. the first two recipients from education. Following that, I learned quite a bit about that systems thinking and the Baldrige approach to systems thinking for an organization, and I was fortunate enough to do my PhD research based on the Baldrige categories, which you see in this slide, and how does leadership impact results that we want to get to. We use mixed methods, procedures, structural equation modeling, which we actually found there was only one person in Alaska that knew how to do, and we were very fortunate that person decided to work with us. But that led to this diagram, and there's a whole lot of math that goes into this, but this diagram shows me there are a couple of routes from leadership to results, and I wanted to just share this, that part of the one of the routes is through your staff, through your workforce, to make sure that those folks have everything they need, the conditions in place to get to the results. And then the other route is through all of the processes that you develop, continuously improve through experience and through research. And I'll just leave it at that. But again, it's a very long dissertation that I could share, and I won't today. But I thought it was important for you folks to know that there is some solid research out there that shows how to get from leadership to results. And we can, and this was based on districts in rural Alaska who were at the time implementing the same educational system that Chugach has been using. Okay, next slide, please. Again, this slide I just wanted to include because it does, again, talk about looking at things from a systems perspective. In order to do that, we felt it's very important to gather input into that system. And that input process truly led to everything else we did for the next 20 years. We thought the input process was going to take part of a year, at most a year. It took 2.5 to 3 years, and it involved business partners and all of our communities, students, staff. We used what we call the Alaska Onward to Excellence. It was a process where we trained students, staff, community members, business partners to co-facilitate the input process. And then we were very clear that we were going to use the input. We weren't going to just get input and then keep doing what we have been doing in the past. We had a lot of data and research and student performance information that wasn't real flattering. And so one thing we did know is we needed to do something different, make some changes. And we also had our leadership at the time, our superintendent and our school board, who publicly declared a 5-year commitment to making some changes based on this input. And without that, you know how educators get a little skeptical when a new initiative starts. Well, here we go, the pendulum's swinging again. That public commitment that we're in this for a minimum of 5 years, and then we'll review it to see if we need to change course, was instrumental in staff having confidence that we were going to continue with this. We didn't know what it was going to look like in the end, but we had some pretty good guiding principles that were developed, collaboratively developed with staff, students, in community, board, etc. And those guiding principles kept us on track. The other part was that third bullet there. I just wanted to make sure folks realizes you just cannot expect folks to come to you. Many do, but some don't, with a growth mindset. And so you need to invest in those folks. And rather than focus so much on recruitment, we really focus on retention. Recruitment's important, but making sure the people that you have are invested in and feel ownership and stay with you after you've invested in them was another key to our success. The next slide. One of the things that I found early as a teacher in my education career was something from American Psychological Associates, I believe. And this is just paraphrased on this slide, but the top 3 things they mentioned that make people happy and motivate folks are these 3 things. And I, as a classroom teacher, tried to use these as some cornerstones or guiding principles to motivate students, because student motivation at that time and still today is always an issue and a concern and something that needs to be attended to. When I ended up in leadership positions, that didn't go away. I still needed to motivate people. So I don't need to read these to you, but those things are very key. They're a cornerstone to all of the work I do. I look at each initiative we want to begin, and through the lens of these 3 things, I ask myself, how are we doing these? How are we making these 3 things happen as we deploy something new or refine something that we have been doing? Next slide, please. Again, I wanted to just include this slide to let folks know how difficult, how challenging it is to change in any organization, in education. And I got this from Schwann and Spady years and years ago, and I shared it with staff, community members during some of these input meetings. And truly, you do need some pretty Herculean winds to blow on that tip of the iceberg to make it go in a different direction than those currents that are underwater that are continuing to push it in the same direction it has gone in the past. And I don't, again, need to read all of those things. I feel I'm probably preaching to the choir, but you're aware of all of those challenges. But I have so often seen schools and districts jump into a reform effort, whether it's competency-based reform or not, some kind of reform effort, for the wrong reasons and not understand the challenges involved. And those reform efforts just implode or not find success that everybody had good intentions with, but didn't really understand what they were getting into. So having the right reasons to get into it and understanding what you're getting into is key to success, and making sure everybody, all stakeholders, are aware of this. Okay, next slide. The ownership mindset. Again, I will probably talk about ownership far too often in the minds of some people. They hear me talk often, but it is, again, a key component that I feel has led to our success. And if we don't have ownership from our students, well, we'll see at a later slide, we have what we call our shared purpose, and at the center it's developing shared, where the students are developing ownership for their own learning and success. If we don't have that, and if we don't have it from our staff and our communities, then each time you run into trouble, whether it's just a small bump in the road or some new bureaucratic challenge, then whomever is in your system, students and staff and community members, they'll turn and point back to you and say, you need to fix your system. But as soon as they have ownership, then they look at those challenges and say, hey, we need to fix this somehow. And they take ownership for helping resolve issues rather than turning to the school or the district or the teacher or the superintendent or the school board or whomever to fix it for them. And so those are some things that just the do's and do nots that I wanted to share with you on that slide. We can go to the next one. Oh, just humor. You can't ever forget that humor is an important thing that we want our graduates to have as well. But I just like to make sure that we don't forget that we are trying to create conditions for problem solving, for innovation. And again, if we're going to do that, we need to model that as teachers, as administrators, building principals, district administrators. I remember in my career this kind of a stage that education went through where they said, you know, the teacher no longer is the sage on the stage, but they're now the guide on the side. And that was a little frightening for some teachers to say, I don't know all of the information. There's no way I can have it all in my mind, but I do know how to help students find that information and become more of a guide. And it was a little frightening. And then I started to see how administrators also were a little frightened to give up a little power. Because when you empower people, you're actually giving up your power and you're handing it to somebody else. And that's a little frightening and challenging for some people to do. But in the long run, it always results, well, I shouldn't say always, I'm sure there are outliers, but it generally will garner greater results for the system and in the long term. Next slide. And this is just the, as I mentioned earlier, our shared purpose and our continuous improvement reform process. The reform process started probably early in the 20-year process, maybe in year 2 or 3. The vision, shared purpose statement, that's something that I thought was going to take a year. That when I started as a superintendent, I needed to reinvigorate at that time we had a shared vision, but I needed to re-energize that and make sure that it still reflected the input from stakeholders. And so we started a 1-year process to do just that. It took 3 years, and I was less concerned about how long it took and more concerned about honoring the input, making sure it was reflected in our shared purpose statement, and then strategically and very deliberately communicating with all stakeholders that their input was used in updating and continuing to fine-tune our system. And so that's that. I think that's my last slide. Is that true, Chris?
That's it. Thank you, Bob. So I didn't see any questions. Susan or Natalie, if you see any questions, just chime in. But I'm wondering, Virgil or Derek, do you have any thoughts on that you might want to add after listening to Bob about leadership during this ramping up process of how to build that ownership of staff? Okay.
Great job. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So it's always great to listen to Bob. I always take something away from him, and Derek is fantastic as well. But I think some key pieces that Bob highlighted that I certainly don't want to have it escape any further is just how important it is that the leaders, and by leaders I don't mean superintendents or administrators, I mean leaders within the learning community, and that could be community members, teachers, students, are a crucial part to this process in terms of the commitment level that's needed to make this vision a reality. And the idea of how we engage and how we support and lead this process and the systems change is just crucial. And I'm glad Bob said the commitment to multiple years, knowing that it's going to be messy at first as we create a commitment, a local commitment to the vision. So I'll talk a little bit about that here in the next few minutes, but I didn't want that to escape the audience as well.
Thanks, Virgil. This is Susan, and I've got a question for Bob from Katrina Schwartz. How did you deal with resistant staff? How do you bring people along who are very invested in the old traditional system and don't want to change? Bob?
Great. Can you hear me? I just want to make sure.
Yep, we can hear you. Thanks.
Okay. Sure, yeah, and of course you're going to run into that. There will be folks that are just very steeped in their own ways and have, they believe in those philosophically, etc. Part of the solution to that was this public commitment by our leadership throughout the district, and letting folks know, even if they didn't feel aligned with where the district was going, that wasn't going to stop the district from going in that direction. And if they felt so uncomfortable with the new expectations, then we would certainly help them find a place to work somewhere else. That was a conversation that was held a couple of times. And in addition, what we did find was that some of those folks that were resistant in the beginning, they were just strong characters, and they just had strong personalities. In order to come out publicly and say, hey, I don't agree with what the superintendent and the school board and the leadership of the district is saying, and I think that's wrong. It takes a little bit of confidence and strength to come out and publicly challenge what a district leadership has very clearly said publicly. And so through training and involving those people and using their input to help develop and fine-tune and continuously improve the system, we found many of those folks that were resistors in the beginning turned into our strongest advocates because they were strong personalities. Many of them were kind of that they didn't have formal authority, but they kind of had the guru status is what we called it. They had status that others would listen to them just because of their personality, their character, how long they were in the district, whatever it was, and others would listen to them. And that guru status in the long run worked for us because we worked with them. We spent a lot of time with training, getting their input, and using their input to help improve the system, because oftentimes their concerns were valid concerns and we needed to address those, and they helped us address them.
Thanks, Bob. There was a follow-up question from Jacob, which you started a little bit touching on. Going off of Katrina's question, what were some of the difficulties you encountered in creating the shared purpose statement?
Well, getting people to show up is always a challenge to participate. Once you get folks talking about education, they're all experts. It doesn't matter who they are. If they're business partners, parents, students, everybody's been through some kind of education, and they have their own experience to draw upon. And so that expertise leads them to have some values about education, some opinions, and so the biggest challenge was just to get them to show up and commit to some time to roll up their sleeves and work with us. It's the same challenges everybody runs into. We had to have door prizes, we had to have food, we had student performances, so parents would come in and watch their students and then would break into a little input meeting. That was usually one of the biggest challenges. What we found, though, is after we deliberately, strategically used input, we copied down information that came from those meetings, and through newsletters, through multiple media sources, we made sure that people were recognized for the input that they gave and how that changed our system. People began to be less reluctant to show up to these meetings because they knew we were actually listening to them and their input was actually being used to develop this system. And so that became less of a problem as we proceeded through the reform process.
Thanks, Bob. And I know we're getting short on time, so Chris, I'm going to turn it back over to you. And Bob, if you can go take a look in the chat room, there are a couple of other questions, which I think you answered, and the answers are yes, but if you want to provide some more detail in the chat. So thank you so much, and I'll toggle off here, and back to you, Chris.
Great, thanks, and thanks, Bob. That was fantastic. Okay, so we're going to go to the second stage of implementation, which is designing the infrastructure for learning. And there's 5 elements that you can find in the paper. Now, I just want to caution, because what we're seeing by a lot of districts is that they're not spending much time on ramping up, and then they're jumping into this stage 2 as if it was a technical reform. And as somebody said in the chat room, the word reform doesn't really capture what this is. Re-engineering is actually probably the most appropriate term for this process of this implementation. And it's really important that you continue to create ownership and the sense of sharing and be very clear about what the principles that you're using in this stage. Now, Virgil Hammonds, who's superintendent of RSU2 in Maine, he was previously the high school principal at Lindsay Unified, and he's now going to be going to KnowledgeWorks as the Chief Learning Officer, will talk to us about his lessons learned and insights about how to think about this stage 2 of designing the infrastructure for learning. So, Virgil, if you toggle on, I'll toggle off, but I will move your slides for you. Virgil? Virgil. Okay, we're having problems hearing Virgil, so what I'm going to do is move us to stage 3, and then hopefully Virgil can go back, sign back on, and get his sound system working. So I'm going to move us to stage 3 and have Derek talk, and then we'll come back to stage 2. This does happen with webinars. Okay, so making stage 3 is the actual transition to a competency-based system. And again, there are these specific stages, specific activities. Now, at this point, we do not know if there's one better way of making a transition to a competency-based system or not. It has a lot to do with the pressures and the forces at work within a district. It has to do with where the leadership is. It has to do with if they've already been investing in personalization or have blended learning going on. They're going to make decisions that are based on what is right for them. But what Derek Hamilton, who's the Dean of Operations at Pittsfield School District, will talk about is the steps they went through in their process. Derek, can you join us?
Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, excellent. I want to thank CompetencyWorks and Chris for the opportunity this afternoon. We're really pleased to share our work and our process. I wanted to start by just maybe taking a step back before we got to the 2010 where we began to implement this. You know, before I was looking at the chat, and people were talking about missions and visions and how that articulates our work. So before we even got into competency-based education and what that process would look like, one of our first steps was to bring our community in at the very beginning and really articulate what is our mission statement, what is our vision for that going to be. We also articulated what we wanted our graduates to look like. So when somebody graduated from Pittsfield Middle High School, what would that student look like? What types of skills, what type of characteristics would they walk away with? And that was really important. It really started to guide our work in the competency-based education process. But ultimately, we spent the first 2 years doing research, going out, doing some visits, We had some teacher leaders really emerge with strong understandings of what competency-based education would look like. They piloted it in their classroom and had an opportunity to talk with their teams and our full faculty about what their experiences were, kind of the do's and don'ts of how to implement within their classroom. And then our third year, we went into implementation. So right now, we're going into our third full year of assessing students based on their mastery of course competencies. So I'll talk about each one of these years in a little bit of detail and be happy to hear questions and reactions from people as well. But I think the first thing really to key on is that in the state of New Hampshire, in 2008, the state legislature passed a law that required public schools to assess students based on their mastery of course competencies. So this is ongoing throughout the state of New Hampshire. Originally, when this movement was coming, we had some people from our school attend statewide conferences, begin to understand what the competency movement was about. But the first time we made an effort to write competencies, there really wasn't much momentum. So I would agree that that uplifting stage is really important, because for a couple of years, our competencies really just sat in a binder and they weren't implemented within the classroom. It didn't change the instruction and the assessment practices at all. So by going back and starting again and focusing on that mission and vision and what those characteristics of our students would be was really critical to guide our work. So if you could go to the next slide. We went back and we built some consensus on what our course competencies would look like, how they would start. For example, all of our course competencies start with students who understand that. And then we begin to build our competencies off of the state standards. The second piece that we did was talk about what our indicator statements would be and how those were different from the competency statements, since we envisioned them as more of the enduring understandings, the bigger picture pieces. And then the indicator statements were kind of the I cans, the things that, the skills or the knowledge that students would have. The state provided us with a state validation tool to look at our course competencies and determine whether or not they met the level of rigor or the depth of knowledge that were necessary. And then we spent quite a bit of time in both our professional development sessions, whether those be faculty days or professional learning days, and even time over the summer. We devoted a lot of our resources to time and opportunities for teachers to work together to write their competencies, to get some feedback from department heads or from their teams, and then have times to meet with our curriculum director, who is now our Dean of Instruction. We can go to the next slide. So we spent the second year thinking about how we were going to bring this information to our community. While they had input and really played a key role in the developing of the mission and vision, they didn't play the same type of role in developing our competency-based education policies and what those would look like. So we spent quite a bit of time in September and October of that second year just getting out into the community, sharing with people that we are going to make this change from a traditional model to a competency-based model. This is the reason for it, and this is what it might look like. Here's the impact that it's going to have on your son or daughter. So that was really critical. The second thing that we did that year was put together a task force that we called the Student Success Through Competencies Task Force. That was really a team of teachers who had a really high understanding of what competency-based education was all about. And they started digging into our current grading practices and started to think more about what our grading practices, policies, and procedures would be with a competency-based system. So we got into thinking about, what are formative and summative assessments? How are they going to be used? Are we going to weight those grades in our assessments? What do ongoing assessments and multiple assessment opportunities look like for students? What would it look like for a student to go back and reassess and try something a second, a third, or a fourth time? So putting to paper some practices and procedures that really guide that work was critical, so that we were consistent from class to class and grade level to grade level. And then finally, in that second year, that team of teachers piloted those course competencies over the spring semester and started to get some feedback from their students about, were the course competencies really student-friendly? Did they understand what they had to know and be able to do at the end of a course? And then were the assessments clear to students, and did they really truly know what they had to do in order to show their knowledge and skills? So if we could move to the third slide. So this is our third year. This is when we went into implementation in grades 7 through 12. All of our courses were based on mastery of course competencies. We held another community event to bring people in, but really what was most powerful is when students had the opportunity to share their work at their student-led conferences. And this is somewhat unintended consequence of our work. It linked really well to competency-based education, because as many community events as we wanted to hold to say this is why we're moving from a traditional model to a competency-based model, and this is what it will look like, it never really hit home until students really shared those artifacts with their parents at student-led conferences. So they would have, an artifact from their social studies class or from their English class, whether that be an essay, a project, and the rubric would be there along with it. So the parents could understand, okay, this is why you got a 3. A 3 might be considered B or proficient work, depending upon the type of scale that you use. But they started to understand how those rubrics assess students' knowledge and skills. So that was an excellent opportunity. And then at the end of the year, we came back together as a faculty, and we talked about what was and what wasn't working. That's really something that we do annually. We're learning more about competency-based education every day, and we're certainly learning as we experience it in our classrooms with our students and get feedback from our families as well. So reflecting on our policies is a critical stage for us. As we got into year 2 in competency-based education, we saw a need to better support our students who are struggling to meet mastery or to show proficiency at a particular standard or competency statement. So we started to look at our Wednesday schedules and think about how we could offer that ongoing support for kids who were either falling a little bit off pace or were working ahead of pace. So we called them support and enrichment blocks, which they would sign up for with their advisors on Monday mornings. So if they needed some additional support in a math or a science course, or they were really doing well in an English or social studies course and they wanted a further understanding or maybe work towards that level 4 on their rubric, they have the opportunities to sign up for some really focused times on Wednesday afternoons to work with teachers on that. And then the second piece that we started to talk about was that, if time really is not the variable anymore and students are working, beyond that 180 days or, they're finishing up over the summer, our teachers, sort of took a college idea and called it office hours. So they're here, usually 1 day a week for 2 hours over the summer. We compensate our teachers for this, but it's an opportunity for kids to check in with their teachers if they are still continuing to work on their course competencies. They can choose to do it when they come back in the fall, but they also have the opportunity to get back on pace over the summer as well. So that's helped to keep some of our kids on that 4-year track. And then our last slide into the 5th year, we started to talk more about our course pace and how students are going to meet these competencies throughout the school year. We actually visited Virgil School, RSU2, earlier this year and took a lot away from the work that RSU2 does to support their students. It's really a personalized environment where kids have the opportunity to come in and pick up where they are, not necessarily where their teacher is at that time of year. So that's been really critical and something that we're beginning to understand and implement into our school systems. And then really our last step is going to be what does this look like for our elementary schools? What does this look like K-6? Because right now competency-based education is only 7 through 12 in our school district. But I think, we understand what our blueprint was over the past 5 years. We know what worked and what didn't work. So we think that it'll really be a key factor for us as some of our teacher leaders and administrators work with our elementary school to begin to think about what course competencies and assessments look like at that age level.
Thanks, Derek. That was terrific. We've got a whole range of questions which I've been tracking, and it looks like Jeff, Nina, and Ashley's questions were answered in the chat room, and thanks for all of the experts that are participating in this webinar for weighing in and helping to answer some of the detailed questions. I have one from Brooke that asks, what is the professional development structure in your district?
So we understood that in order to make this transformation, we needed to find time to do it. And a once a Monday faculty meeting or a quarterly professional learning day wasn't going to do it. So we looked at our Wednesday schedules, and we took the first hour and a half of each day. So every Wednesday, we call it Late Start Wednesday. Our kids don't arrive until 9:30, but our faculty arrives at 8 o'clock. And we use that first hour and a half for either internal professional development, where it's led by a teacher leader or somebody with a particular strength in a focused topic, or we'll bring in external providers during that hour and a half to start to bring us along in developing either our competency statements, our rubrics, our assessment practices, whatever the particular topic of the year might be. We'll use those Late Start Wednesday opportunities to really build capacity and leadership among our faculty.
Thanks, Derek. There's another question, too, which asks, how do you feel about your timeline? Looking back, would you do a 5-year plan if you could do it all over again?
I think that's a great question, one that we maybe haven't spent as much time with going back and thinking about what we could do differently. But what I would say is that we spent an awful lot of time in that first year or two thinking about what the competency statements were going to be and how are they going to be different from the ICANN statements. We're very concerned about using consistent language. And while that's really important, we didn't focus enough time on the assessment practices. How would our assessments change? How could we write an assessment and a rubric that connected to a general competency statement? So I think if we could do something over again, we'd spend a little less time focusing on the consistency of the language within our competency statements and focusing more time on how our rubrics connected to those competency statements to make sure that those assessment students were doing really meaningful and authentic.
Great, thanks. And I know we've got to keep moving, so I'll just throw one more question out and then ask you to go back into the chat room and take a look at the question from Jeff and Sean that we didn't get to. Derek, early on in your presentation, had asked a question on implementation. Are your competencies in a binder or in the classroom? And I would just add, are they online? Where, the nitty gritty, where do you go? Where are the competencies?
So the competencies are in several places. The first day of school, all of our teachers are handing out course syllabi with the competencies on them and timelines for when they're going to hit those competencies over the course of the school year. Teachers are also starting to develop their own websites, which are linked on our school website as well, and that's really what we're moving towards moving forward. We used Atlas Rubicon as a sort of data storage base I shouldn't say a data storage base, as a curriculum storage base earlier. But we're moving away from Atlas and really beginning to utilize our course website so that all the information, whether it be about competencies, whether it be about assignments, whether it be about upcoming events in a particular class, that's all in one place and easily accessible for students, family, and community members.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Derek. That was just fantastic. And please do, there's a lot of questions for you in the chat room, and we're moving quickly back, as fast as I can get there, to Virgil's slides. And Virgil, take it away on stage 2, designing the learning infrastructure.
Great. Just want to make sure everyone can hear me now.
We can hear you.
Excellent. Apologize for that. I actually am at Thomas College supporting the Boys and Girls Nation here in Central Maine, and so I had some kids help me out, make sure I'm all set to go here. So my apologies for that. But I'm glad to follow Bob and Derek because they gave a fantastic overview of the commitments and the structures that are necessary to be put in place to make this vision a reality. And the first slide that I start with here, the visuals and the statements essentially are speaking to the work that Bob and Derek described. What we're talking about here is a complete restructure. Examples I had used in the past was the idea of knocking down some load-bearing walls in buildings and replacing them with something entirely new. But since I've been through this work in a couple different learning communities and a couple different coasts, my thinking has changed entirely. My thought now is that really what we need to do is knock down the entire building down to its foundation and start anew. But the foundation is strong. I mean, we built this. This country was defined on this great ideal that we can educate the masses and everyone, which is absolutely an amazing undertaking and one that should be celebrated. But now we're at a point where we live in a world that is much smaller, that needs to be customized for the needs of every person. I mean, we have all of this technology and access to information that our kids are so accustomed to doing from the very beginning that we need to modify our learning structures to allow that thinking and that environment that I see these kids here walking around Thomas College thriving in. So how do we support and create a new structure on a very sound foundation that is based on meeting the needs of every learner that comes through our community, and we support it through standards and competencies and structures that ensure that the kids leave us prepared to tackle the rigors of the world. We can continue on there, Chris. So when we first started education, what we did a lot is in one-room schoolhouse, we essentially gave this depth of information that we expected our kids to acquire, whether it's basic math, basic reading, literacy skills, some history, and we delivered that to a variety of ages with the idea that when they left, they were prepared to be successful citizens. Next slide, please. We quickly learned in our research and learning that, look, we can't just be about the great direct instruction. We have to do some other, we have to provide some other supports that ensure that every child is getting what they need. So whether it's through the use of technology, effective instructional strategies, one-on-one instruction, small group instruction, collaborative instruction, whatever that may be, it's our responsibility to ensure that we're creating structures that support the unique needs of every child. You can go to the next one, please. But the latest research has evolved even further, right? So how do we take what we know to be best practices, and how do we engage our kids and our staff and our communities in being a part of this creation of this new process? How do we empower and motivate them to take greater ownership of the structures that exist within our learning communities and foster those interests? So here is an example of a CTE class and a couple of students working on a loom, and the idea of understanding how their history standards can also be applied in a different and more engaging way. But the best part is that it wasn't just about history; it was also about math and science and multiple standards. Yet here is an opportunity where kiddos perhaps might not have been at all ever stepped into this lab environment. So in thinking about those structures, how do we create these pieces, and what are the systemic processes that have to be in place to make these types of learning opportunities possible? Continue to the next slide, please. Oh, geez, I can't read that too well on my piece. So, but I'll try to define it all for you. So what are those competencies, as we heard Derek speak of, what are those competencies that we want to hold our kiddos accountable to? They have to be crystal clear and transparent, unlike this slide. What are the levels, what are the steps, what are the strands that we want our kids to accomplish, and what are we as educators holding ourselves accountable to? As you heard Derek say just a few minutes ago, he had talked about when handing out the syllabi, the competencies were also distributed at the start of the class. Complete shift, right? We're no longer the teacher that is holding the secret to understand how to earn that top level grade, but really what we're saying is here are the expectations for all of you to learn. Let's be crystal clear about what the expectations are and to what rigor point that we want you to achieve that. So in my second bullet, what it actually says there is a very explicit and clearly defined scoring scale for every single competency. So it's not about a chapter in a textbook. It's not about the syllabi itself, but it's a clearly defined scale that says, in respect to learning in this content, in this particular level, here's how you achieve mastery. Here's how you achieve competency. The third bullet speaks to a taxonomy, which for us was, if we had to do it over again, we would have started with a we've spent a majority of our time focusing on the taxonomy, which is the rigor level. To what point do we want kids to achieve mastery? And this goes for K through 12, and we implemented K through 12 going into our 5th year of a truly competency-based system at all levels. And a piece where we really started to flourish is when students really understood what it meant to be competent at every level. And within every one of our competencies, and I didn't include one here, but I'll send you a link here in the chat room to our learner-centered news section, which clearly defines what mastery looks like at every level, and also clearly defines what the rigor point is for every learning target and measurement topic that we've defined in our learning continuum. And lastly, the last bullet point there speaks to how do we personalize these learning opportunities for our students, for all of our kids. So the competencies are the same for every child. The expectations are the same for every child. Yet how they achieve those competencies and how they prove mastery of our learning continuum is unique to that child. What is their interest? What empowers them and motivates them to go deeper with their learning? And so we have to develop structures that allows for that to happen. How do we take what they have planned for their future, and how do we apply that to the competencies that exist within our learning continuum? So if you can move on. I'm talking very quickly because I'm looking at the time frame here, so my apologies.
Yeah, Virgil, when you just said if we were to do it again, we'd do blank, I think that was a little bit quick. Could you mind repeating that for us?
Certainly. The key piece of competencies is in the title. So what does it mean to be competent, and competent at each level? So for us, we would have focused more of our time on clearly understanding what the taxonomy levels mean and how to achieve, and we use Marzano's taxonomy. So what is the difference from reflection and understanding to application or implementation? So understanding the differences in the rigor points is really crucial. So in the past, oftentimes we were providing assessments at the retrieval level, which is very low-level application. And really we want kids to truly be competent to dig deeper than that, to analyze and apply and truly understand what it means to be competent at every level. So we would have spent more time on the rigor points in the taxonomy.
Thank you so much. And good, time for a question here from Greg. Would you describe creating conditions for school transformation as an emergent or a planned phenomenon?
Yeah, great question. I'm going to piggyback back on what Derek and Bob had said. The idea of creating a commitment to this vision, which is, again, truly about not chipping away at the old structure, but truly redesigning and redefining the structure. It truly takes some different level of thinking and foresight as to how you're going to proceed here. So I would say we as leaders, and again, I can't stress it enough, leaders does not mean administration. Leaders within the learning community, and this includes students, parents, business leaders, or municipal leaders, have to have this unwavering commitment to ensuring that this vision becomes a reality. So the process that Bob spoke of and that Derek reflected on in his first year of implementation are absolutely crucial and key points that can't be missed. As much as in education we want to start with the standards and the assessments and the instructional practice, which I absolutely agree we need to always reflect and refine, that community engagement and that commitment to this vision is absolutely a crucial step that cannot be missed.
Our Susan one. Virgil, thank you. You were both technologically challenged, and I don't know what happened to the slide. We've put the slide information into the chat room, and people can also get that slide, which is a very important slide at the wiki. And we have one more question, and just well, actually, you know what? I'm going to just stop right now. Put all your questions into the chat room. We're going to organize them and try to get some answers from our team here and others as well to be able to resolve them, because I don't think we can answer all the questions that just came in. So Virgil, Derek, and Bob, thank you very much, and thank you so much for all the work that you've done in your communities. You're really leading the nation. You're making a difference for the children in your communities, and taking the time to share your insights with all of us, even though this was just the quickest little bite of all that you know and all that the leadership that has to actually go into guiding this implementation process. We just really want to thank you. And again, everybody leave your questions, and we'll do our best to answer them on the blog over the next couple of weeks. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks again to Virgil, Bob, and Derek. That was fantastic. Take care, and we'll see you later. Bye-bye.
Thanks and goodbye.